I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Ukraine strikes yet more oil and gas facilities deep inside Russia, we hear how Donald Trump has deported dozens of political refugees fleeing Vladimir Putin back to the country. We report how Putin's present for General Gerasimov's 70th birthday was a nice medal and an extension of his military service. And we report on Monday's Defence Forum in London, where I interviewed Boris Johnson, who said that the coalition of the willing should be deployed to Ukraine now.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 9th of September, 3 years and 199 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by long-time Russia reporter James Kilner. I started with the latest from the battlefront. So let's go inside Ukraine. And a Russian airstrike this morning on the village of Yurovka in Donetsk Oblast has killed 21 people. This is a breaking story, so the numbers have been going up through the morning, unfortunately. President Zelensky said this morning the bombing happened as pensions were being distributed in the village. This is about 20 k's north of Sloviansk. So on social media, President Zelensky said such Russian strikes must not be left without an appropriate response from the world. The world must not remain idle. A response is needed from the United States. A response is needed from Europe. A response is needed from the G20. Other than that, you will be unsurprised to hear next to no movement on the ground. The pattern of late, and we shouldn't take this for granted, but the pattern of late has been almost no movement on the ground, but what there is generally going west by Russia. Meanwhile, as you'll hear shortly, Ukraine continues its long-range, seemingly successful long-range campaign against Russian oil and gas infrastructure inside Russia. Now, a reported Ukrainian drone strike on the Russian city of Sochi on the Black Sea coast is said to have killed one person overnight, the local Russian governor said this morning. The attack may have coincided with a visit by Vladimir Putin to the city. No suggestion if he was the target. According to the Kremlin, he joined a BRICS summit online from Sochi yesterday, and Russian independent media outlet Agentstvo reported that his, the Ilyushin jet, the IL-96, the big presidential jet that doubles as a command post, it was actually an IL-96 300PU, that was remained at the city's airport during the alleged drone attack. Either they didn't know it was happening or they decided the threat was nullified. Elsewhere inside Russia, a series of explosions in the Russian city of Penza yesterday disabled a gas and oil pipeline. This is a source in Ukraine's military intelligence, the HUR, speaking to the Kyiv Independent, continuing that campaign, as I said. Now, at least 4 explosions were reportedly heard around 0400 in the city. This is about 500 k's southeast of Moscow. The main oil pipeline in Penza, said to have a capacity of 2 million barrels a day, and a regional gas pipeline were taken out of service, the source said to the Kyiv Indy, although they didn't clarify the cause of the blasts, nor would you expect them to. Penza Oblast Governor Oleg Melnichenko reported an air raid alert in the region last night, but didn't make any mention of pipeline explosions. And on the back of that, local media there reported that the Transneft Druzhba, the company that owns the state-owned pipeline operator, had been carrying out planned exercises at oil and gas facilities yesterday in cooperation with emergency services and special authorities. So Russian authorities urged citizens to, in their words, remain calm and trust only verified sources of information. It's not bad advice, actually. But according to the intelligence source, the HUR source speaking to the Kyiv Indy, they say that announcement was only intended to conceal the explosions, which kind of belies him or her not saying what the cause was earlier. Anyway, elsewhere, into Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea, the decapitated body of Alexei Shinistin. He was the chief exec of the potassium and magnesium mining firm K Potash Service, His body was found in Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, making him the 19th Russian executive to die under mysterious circumstances since the start of the full-scale invasion. Mr. Sinitsyn's body was found under a bridge with a tow rope attached to the body. Russian state media outlet RIA Novosti reporting this, citing a source in local law enforcement there. No further details known about why he may have been targeted or if it was not in any way connected to him being a massive oligarch. But according to a ruling by the Kaliningrad Regional Arbitration Court in October 22, his company was in serious financial difficulty. Now, we've reported on these unexplained deaths of senior executives. They are normally the oil and gas sector, but you may remember in January this year, the Russian FSB counterintelligence officer Vladimir Feschenko was found dead in a Russian defense ministry building in Moscow. At the time, his death, so Feschenko's death, was said to have highlighted the mounting internal tensions within Russia's security and military institutions, but there's no suggestion that Mr. Sinitsyn was involved in that. Now, elsewhere in the US, Donald Trump has deported dozens of political refugees fleeing Vladimir Putin, deported them back to Russia. At least 2 deportation flights have returned Russian dissidents who say they fear they're going to face retribution from the Kremlin. Russians who fled the country after Putin invaded Ukraine, speaking to our colleague Susie Cohen in the Telegraph's US office, say they fear being torn from their families and sent home amid Mr. Trump's ongoing immigration crackdown. Now, some people Susie's been speaking to branded the practice cruel and mean, warning that Putin will use the crackdown on Russians to discredit the West and scare dissidents into believing that they cannot escape to safety. One chap, a married father, speaking to Susie, who asked to remain anonymous, fearing for his family's safety, told the Telegraph how, having escaped Moscow in 2022, he lives in fear that he will be taken from his family and forced back to Russia. He and his family entered the US legally on visas before applying for asylum, but he said he now fears Mr. Trump could suddenly decide to deport them, given that they were allowed in whilst Joe Biden was in power. He said, "What we fear is some chaotic, spontaneous campaign in Trump's spirit to expel absolutely all Russian asylum seekers who are allowed in the country under Biden. That would be disastrous for us. We would never, for love or money, agree to detention and separation from our children. If I were forced to return to Putin's Russia, nothing good would await me there. I could face treason charges." He continues, "They put an ultimatum in the face of good people. Accept the detention centre and you'll be shackled and taken from your children for a few months, or agree to be deported." Now, Vladimir Oshechkin, who's a Russian human rights activist who runs the website gulagu.net, told the Telegraph, "Unfortunately, my worst fears and predictions are coming true. People in need of protection, fleeing from the war and Putin's dictatorship, torture and repression by the FSB, ended up in US prisons in orange overalls and shackles during transfer like criminals." He said, "This is cruel and mean, and now Russian propaganda and Putin's special services will actively use it to discredit the West and America with the narrative that there's nowhere to run, and even America will not save you." Mr. Oshechkin said, "We appeal to the US authorities to stop these deportations and conduct an investigation." We will put the link to Susie's article in the episode notes for today. Now, just finally for me, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called on the coalition of the willing to deploy to Ukraine now and not wait for any US brokered or otherwise achieved peace deal. So you may remember yesterday I dialed in from the Borderlands Foundation Ukraine Defence Forum in London. I moderated a couple of panels there. The last one of the evening had British former Prime Minister Boris Johnson on it. He gave a little speech beforehand. He said the presence of Western forces in Ukraine would show Putin that the country is firmly part of the West's security framework. He called for the frozen Russian assets to be freed up, the money from them. He said troops from outside Ukraine would show Putin does not decide which foreign countries get to come to Ukraine and to help its defences. He said the coalition of the willing could be visible proof right now to answer the question Putin needs answering in his own head. The answer to that question is that Ukraine is part of the Western security architecture, and that's fundamentally where it's going. He said we need to incarnate that choice by our presence in Ukraine and make it physically and practically clear that Ukraine's on the path towards Western institutions, not just the EU, but one day NATO too. Mr. Johnson carried on. He said, "My question to European leaders now in the UK and everywhere is, if immediate membership of UK is off the table, and I very much regret that it is, but why don't we only assemble the coalition of the willing, but also begin the deployment of that coalition? The thing is, this entity, whatever it is, peacekeeping force, boots on the ground, whatever they do, they are not going to engage Russians in war fights. That's not going to happen. That being so, there is nothing to stop them going now. That's what we should do. We should deploy them now." It's kind of made his point a few times there. Not like Boris to try and run the clock down. Anyway, he said they're there for political purposes. They're there to show that the ultimate destiny of Ukraine is part of the Western security architecture. Get them in now. Then with a possible subtle dig, shall we say, at the style with which Donald Trump is managing his relationship with Putin, Boris Johnson said, "There's only one set of arguments that he understands," that's Putin, "and it isn't flattery. You can't schmooze Putin. You won't change his calculations by red carpet treatment or fly-pasts. That's not going to cut the mustard." No response from the White House yet on that. The panels that we ran yesterday, and the reason Francis is not here today is because he's running one at the moment. I think it's just finished. We are going to have access to the audio and I think the video as well from those panels, so we will put them out in due course. But you'll see Boris Johnson's speech and also then the panel that I ran with him. Also, former General H.R. McMaster from the US, who was actually National Security Advisor under the Trump 1 presidency. He was very, very good. Michael Kaufman as well from the Carnegie Institute and War on the Rocks podcast, brilliant. And Sergei Vysitsky, who represents NAUDA in the National Association of Ukrainian Defense Industries, really speaking about how when we talk about depth, as in strength in depth, how having that, you cannot hope to have some kind of reassurance force or a deterrence force without that strength through the industrial base. But anyway, we will put all that in front of you, if you so wish, in due course. Now, I'm delighted to welcome back to the pod James Kilner. A lot, as ever, James, going on. And I'm not just talking about your new moustache, although it is very Tom Selleck, I have to say. In Russia, a few things going on the defence side. Then I want to turn to the diplomatic and the economic. But what's been catching your eye on the diplomatic side? Welcome.
Hi, Dom. Thanks for introducing the pod to my new moustache.
Thank you. Tash, pod.
I'm sure they're very interested. Is Russia becoming more militarised? Well, can it become more militarised than it already is, Dom? I mean, it can't obviously become any more militarised. This is a highly militarised society, highly militarised economy, etc. There are some highlights I just wanted to alert your listeners to. The first is a very, well, I think, according to Russian media this morning, we're looking at a very small scale but instrumental change in the defence ministry. The Vedomosti newspaper was reporting, quoting two sources inside the Kremlin, saying that the first deputy industry minister, a guy called Vasily Asmakov, is going to be promoted to become the deputy defence minister. Now, Asmakov, according to his biography, he's 42 years old. He spent his entire career inside Russia's industry ministry, first as a researcher, then as assistant to the minister, then back into the Strategic Development Department, and then as Deputy Minister, and then First Deputy Minister. We think he's going to be shifted over to the Defence Ministry, which is a continuation of a trend that was started last year with the appointment of Andrei Belousov to become the Minister of Defence, a career economist. This is all part of what's sort of pithily known as the spreadsheetisation of the Defence Ministry, to concentrating on numbers and supplies and logistics. Wars are won through logistics. And it also shows the dominance of the Defence Ministry, I think. This is obviously a relatively high respected chap, knows his way around the Industry Ministry, who's been shunted over to bring that knowledge under the Defence Ministry. The next point on this issue is the 70th birthday of Vladimir Gerasimov. He's in charge of the Russian military. Yesterday, for his 70th birthday, Putin awarded him the Order of Courage. This is one of the Russian state's top awards. The citation was for courage, bravery, and dedication displayed in the fulfillment of military duty. Gerasimov has been running Putin's war in Ukraine. He's been cited by the International Criminal Courts for war crimes. When I've been reading the newspapers, Russian newspapers yesterday and today, this is a very prominent story, which means the Kremlin is pushing this story. They want Gerasimov back on the news pages. He is sort of written up as some sort of hero in Russia. Obviously a very different view of him in Ukraine and much of the rest of the world, but definitely considered a hero in Russia. A little bit of extra detail here as well. Officially, in the Russian military, generals have to retire at 70. So Putin's had to sign an executive order to extend Gerasimov's reign as a number one military guy. The third point on this overarching theme of militarization in Russia is a 28-year-old guy called Timirlan Abutalimov has been promoted as Minister of Religion down in Dagestan, that's southern Russia. This is interesting because he's a former army lieutenant. He was a police investigator in 2022 and he actually volunteered to fight in Ukraine in autumn 2022. So he gave up his job as an investigator in Dagestan, took up arms and fought with the Russian army, for the Russian army against Ukrainians, got promoted to become a lieutenant and ended up being company commander, given a Hero of Russia award by Putin in about December 2023, followed quickly by an Order of Courage award, the same award that Gerasimov was given on Monday. And then, May 2024, Ukrainian investigators charged this guy, Abutalimov, with war crimes. There's drone footage of 4 Ukrainian soldiers in the Zaporizhia region of southern Ukraine surrendering to a Russian unit, identified as Abutalimov's unit. 4 soldiers lie on the ground and then the Russian soldiers shoot them in the back of the head. So, very serious allegations of war crimes against this guy. But in Russian society, he's seen as a hero. This is the point here, Dom. He's seen as a hero. He took part in something called a Time of Heroes campaign, a Kremlin, well, actually a Putin pet project, launched in February 2024 to promote veterans of his war in Ukraine as the new elite who are going to take high-ranking bureaucratic positions, some of them directly within the Kremlin's reporting line, but others in the regions. This is a regional promotion. He was handpicked out of many applicants, and he was given apparently an 11, 12-month internship, as it's been written up in the Russian media, directly with the governor of Dagestan. And now he's been given this ministerial position, a 28 Minister of Religion. You know, all this highlights the militarization of Russia, etc., and the promotion of so-called war heroes into these important bureaucratic positions. Although this wasn't directly a Kremlin appointment, Dagestan is, in many ways, more vital, more strategically important to the Kremlin, more complicated for the Kremlin to control than other regions, or than many other regions of Russia, let's put it like that. It's a restive region, it lies on the Caspian Sea, it borders Azerbaijan, it's mainly Muslim. There are semi-regular so-called terrorist activities down there. They have pogroms. There's a Jewish community there which is often targeted. There was a big pogrom at Makhachkala. Makhachkala is the capital of Dagestan. Makhachkala airport in 2023, you might remember. It's a big recruitment ground for the army, and this is partly why Abutalimov has been promoted, so that people in Dagestan can see that if you join the military, you get fast-tracked into these positions. But also, because of its position on the Caspian Sea, it has been taking, and we're not sure if they're still continuing, but it has been taking cargo from Iran, some of which will have been munitions, drones, possibly missiles. There are other bigger ports on the Caspian Sea that Russia uses, but some of it will be going to the port in Dagestan near Makhachkala. Also, Dagestan now lies on this very important trade route that the Kremlin has been setting up to India. North-south trade route is called, which links through Dagestan, overland through Azerbaijan, towards the South Indian continent, basically.
So they've got all this amazing geography and history and culture to refer to, and they come up with the hugely inventive title of the North-South Trade Route.
That's right, yeah.
Right.
But it is important. The Kremlin has spent billions upgrading the railway network in Azerbaijan on behalf of the Azerbaijanis. And, there's a whole other side story about Putin and Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, falling out, and how that jeopardizes that trade route. But my point is a simple one. Dagestan is a very important region for the Kremlin to keep on top of. And this guy, this 28-year-old war veteran, is now Minister of Religion in this region.
That's fascinating. I think that this guy's been accused of war crimes, and that matters not a jot to Russia. I'm less surprised at it. You'll remember Alexander Litvinenko was murdered here in London with polonium-210 poisoning. One of the two people there, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Koftin, that were held by the British to be responsible for that. Andrei Lugovoy was feted, and I think he was given Hero of Russia as well, actually. But he was also made a member of the Duma, so he's an MP, free from prosecution, etc., etc. So lauding those that have had crimes against humanity labelled against them doesn't seem to be a problem for Russia.
So, back to Argentina. This was the Kremlin responding to yet another accusation from Argentina that it's mounting a disinformation campaign against the Argentinian government, and also an accusation from Argentina that the Kremlin or Kremlin agents were actually wiretapping the presidential palace in Argentina. And Russia, of course, came out and said this was absolute nonsense and it would never get up to this sort of underhand tricks. Make your own mind up sort of thing. But these allegations against Russia, specifically Argentina, are not new, Dom. Last year, Argentinian officials accused the Kremlin of pushing its propaganda channels heavily in Argentina. The US even weighed in alongside Argentina and said it had picked up information that Russia was doing this as well. Earlier this year, Argentinian security agents, arrested several Argentinians and accused them of taking money to spread Russian disinformation, etc., etc. This story highlights the Kremlin's attitude towards hybrid warfare. More normally, when we talk about hybrid warfare, we think of GPS jamming, migration, that sort of thing. But it's happening on a wider basis as well, Dom. Certainly, the Argentinian officials really think they're in line for a bit of this. Argentina, under President Milei, supports the US and has been a vocal proponent of Ukraine, so obviously becomes a target for Russia. We also know historically the Kremlin has seen South America as very much the US's backyard, which it takes great pleasure in meddling in and sees a strategic advantage in meddling in as well. Plenty of cases through the Soviet Union, up to now. Also, there's an interesting side story here, which you could argue may give the Kremlin cover to drop in agents or to certainly spread influence. Argentina did have very loose rules for gaining citizenship and passports. And certainly at the beginning of the war, there was these plane loads full of 8.5-month pregnant women were flying into Argentina, giving birth in Argentina. Their babies getting automatic Argentinian passports, a very useful thing, especially if you're from Russia. Once the babies got Argentinian citizenship, it was far easier for parents to then apply and get citizenship and a passport as well. They would pretty much automatically get that within a couple of years. Argentina has rolled back on some of those rules, but there was a wave of Russians coming into Argentina for about 3 years after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which could have given Kremlin some cover of getting its agents in there. So another wider global story prism through which the Kremlin views its war against the West.
And just finally, as they sort of tour around the world, but things we do need to bring to your attention, Rosatom, Russian nuclear agency, channeling their sort of inner British spy with the name's Bond, Panda Bond. What's that all about?
Yeah, nice intro. This is actually a very interesting story. Rosatom and also Gazprom, the major energy company, are reportedly looking at launching so-called Panda bonds. These are yuan-denominated bonds issued by non-Chinese companies inside China. Now, this is a reflection of how important the Chinese financial system, the Chinese economy has become to Russia since all these sanctions were thrown down after the war in Ukraine. Russian companies have become very reliant on the yuan. The yuan's become the most traded currency in Russia, very reliant on the yuan to basically buy and sell goods abroad. We know that Russian companies in the main have been running out of money. Inflation, interest rates, sanctions, etc. made everything much more complicated, much more expensive, running out of clients, etc. There's a major bailout happening at the moment. The Kremlin's organising a $5.5 billion bailout for Rushydro, a major energy company. So Russian companies are running out of money. They're looking for new sources of money to tap into. And there is a move by the larger Russian companies, which aren't sanctioned or less sanctioned, to issue these panda bonds in China. The Russian central bank is less keen on this and would rather yuan-denominated bonds issued in Russia. But the problem with that for the Russian companies is that the debt market in Russia is so much smaller. There's just not the capital there to raise the cash that they want. So They are literally looking at this panda bond way of doing things. Now, if Rosatom and Gazprom did issue these so-called panda bonds, they would be the first Russian company, well, there's only been one other Russian company to have done this, Rusal, in I think 2017. So this is a big step by these Kremlin-linked companies. There was a rush of so-called panda bonds in 2023 and 2024. I'm not sure there's been any this year, and that was because of the general geopolitical situation. These weren't Russian companies, these were other companies trying to tap into the Chinese bond market. But with increased US secondary sanctions, or at least the threat of secondary sanctions, the Chinese banks have really slowed down their processing of Russian business, and analysts say that the appeal of buying debt issued by a Russian corporate is hugely diminished because of the threat of secondary sanctions for obvious reasons. So we still have some way to go here. This is an important story to watch. If panda bonds are successfully launched by Rosatom and Gazprom, it could well pave the way for more state-linked, or at least sort of large Russian corporates to do the same. And then you really have the spectre of Chinese investors backing Kremlin-linked companies.
Yeah, and yet more evidence, I guess, that Russia is just increasingly subservient to China here and dependent upon China. A new report about the fate of Ukrainian children taken by Russia came out over the weekend. It's a partnership between War Child, an NGO that helps children affected by conflict around the world, and Save Ukraine. It sheds more light on the indoctrination, militarization and torture suffered by these children. Adélie spoke with War Child Chief Exec Helen Pattinson and with Labour MP Johanna Baxter, who has been leading the campaign for these children and especially the latest rounds of sanctions announced last week. Here is her report.
You're releasing a report about the stolen children of Ukraine. What has your organisation been involved in when it comes to children in Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion?
So we were working in Ukraine 2 days after war broke out. So we weren't there beforehand, but we were on the ground very quickly. And in all the movement and that takes place when a war breaks out, children are always particularly vulnerable, and particularly girls are vulnerable. So we were trying to get ourselves established on the borders, particularly doing work to prevent trafficking and protection of girls. Very quickly partnered with Ukrainian organisations, and so our work is centred around child protection. It's also around psychological support for children. There's a lot of organisations that quite rightly do the sort of physical support, the blankets, the food, all the things that people need, but we know that what war does to children is inflicts trauma, and so that creates psychological distress, and children need help to be able to recover from that. They're very capable of recovering from that, but they do need help and specialist support. So that's what we've been doing in Ukraine for the last 3 years now.
I think our listeners can probably hear the music behind your voice while we're doing this interview. So would you mind explaining to us where we are and what is this space?
Yeah, so it's lovely to be able to describe to you where we are. We're in Outernet, so we're in the very heart of London, just outside Tottenham Court Road Tube Station. Outernet's got a series of beautiful buildings. They're public exhibition spaces, and essentially floor to ceiling is projections of our campaign, which is Return Every Child. And then there are 19,546 paper dolls that are being displayed, and that is to represent the number of children that have been taken forcibly from their homes in Ukraine and into Russia. You can also hear the music, so there is excerpts of a really important film that is about to be released, and so that's playing in the background, and it's called Children Under Fire.
The installation, as you said, is in Tottenham Court Road in London. It's a very, very central place. It's very visible from the street. Do you think the British public hasn't been aware enough of this happening, and why do you think that is?
So look, I think the British public is incredibly aware of the situation in Ukraine, and they've been incredibly supportive as well. What I don't think has been well documented or well understood is this very specific issue, and that is children who have been forcibly removed from their homes. And I think it's really important to try and unpack that. What do I mean, and what does forcibly transferred mean? So that may be that they have been asked to sign up to go to a camp that they perceive to be a recreational camp. It may be that they've been served served military papers. It may be that they have been taken by some kind of force. There's lots of complex reasons why that has happened. And I think what's really important to highlight is those children, the ones that have gone missing, the ones whose families are searching for them, want to know where they are. There's also 1 million more children that are living in occupied areas in Ukraine. And I guess what I want to highlight is that the issues that are affecting those groups of children are the same. So we would describe it in our report as indoctrination and militarization. So it means that children's identities are being erased, their passports might be removed from them, and they might be issued with Russian passports. Often receiving any kind of medical help is a condition of having a Russian passport. It means they're being asked to stop talking their language. In many cases, their names are changed. They're told to forget about their families. So if you just step back and think about that for the moment, the very core of who we are, our name, our identity document, our ability to access any kind of medical care, our language, our culture, our family, without that, what identity do we have? It's a very, very distressing situation. And that we know from the research that we've done that 55% of children in that situation have been exposed to that. 41% of children have been exposed to militarization. And so that is really shocking. And the report is quite a difficult read in that sense, because it describes children being given air rifles, being shown how to use them, and then asked to use them. It describes children throwing hand grenades. It describes children being trained in the use of mines, of searching and clearing for mines, of military drills, of essentially being forced to join groups. And so it's a really, really serious issue. And I think it's worth saying, by the way, that when I mentioned those stats, they overlap as well. Some children would have been subject to both of those things.
What I think shows up in the report as well is the use of torture and punishment in order to keep the children in line and to make them obedient. Can you talk a little bit about that and the sort of examples that you've come across in your interviews?
Yeah, of course I can. I mean, what the report says is that 10% of those children would have been subject to that torture. So that's a very high number. It includes 6% subject to sexual violence. What we know about the children that we've interviewed is the children that we've interviewed are the ones that have been able to come home. And what that indicates is there are many more children probably in much more vulnerable situations. So I think that figure is most likely to be higher. The report is a difficult read for anybody to read because it talks about what those children have been through, and the torture can take many forms. So the children describe physical torture, so it's things like being plunged into cold, very, very cold, icy water if they've said something that's wrong. It describes violence towards them directly if they've expressed any kind of dissent or any kind of, no, I'm Ukrainian, and said that. It also goes into really horrible, life-threatening situations that they've been put into and asked to complete military exercises, military drills, with not the right equipment, with no safety standards. And then also just horrible things to think about, like children being exposed to doing excessive forms of exercise in the course of the military training, children being kept in very small rooms, children being kept in just inhumane conditions without access to toilet. And then it does go on to describe children seeing, witnessing and experiencing horrific forms of physical torture that has resulted in death as well. I think beyond that, we shouldn't underemphasise the impact of psychological wounds that inflicts. When children are exposed to seeing and experiencing those kind of things, it does permanent psychological damage if it's left untreated. And certainly of the people that we've had the opportunity to talk to as a result of this report, we know that sort of 60% of them have got moderate to high PTSD as a result. And so that means they are unable to sit in a room like we are doing now. Their breathing would be irregular, their heart rate would be raised, they have got no emotional regulation or context for any kind of conversation. They would be experiencing acute stress response systems because of that. And so really that that's not okay. We know there are many forms of psychological impact of children when they're caught up in war. So typically when I do sort of work around the world, I may see children who are old children who are wetting the bed, children suffering from nightmares, children that are unable to talk, children that are experiencing suicidal feelings, all of those things. And so we know it's very complicated. But what I would want to say is, it is very possible for children to recover from what's happened here with the right psychological support for them.
The children that you've interviewed, there are 200 interviews feeding into that report. Obviously, it seems like a big number, but it's actually a very small number of children who have managed to escape and to flee these horrible conditions. How have they managed to escape? And is there a sort of common denominator amongst all of them?
Look, it's very complicated when you get into those cases, and I'm not able to go into the detail of the cases, as you'd understand, to kind of protect those children. But we are partnering with Save Ukraine, who are an organisation that Wolfschild work closely with. The business of Save Ukraine as an organisation is to find out information, to be able to access, to be able to locate, to be able to identify where those children are being held. When they've got that information, they've been able to complete around 600 to 700 essentially missions to return those children home and to be able to get them back. And then what's really critical when they've got them back is to ensure that there is appropriate care for those children as well, who've been through very difficult things. Reintegration into family life, into community life, is not easy in those circumstances at all. And so we're working with them to ensure that as children come home, there's access to appropriate psychological help for what they've experienced, and also legal help as well, to call to account the people who've committed those crimes and taken the children away from their families.
The Russian budget for youth policy, as they call it, rose from $50 million in 2022 to $460 million in 2024, and that's due to rise again in 2025. What does that show about Russia's intention?
You can see the evidence. That's why the report is so good at pointing out the evidence, because many of these issues are quite hard for us to understand. There's always kind of partisan positions to take in war. And so I think going back to the evidence, which is what we as a sort of neutral and impartial humanitarian actor try to do all the time, to say there is clear evidence that that is happening. And we can also see the evidence of Russia having a very clear position. They've actually explicitly stated that they want to have 70% participation in these activities. And it's very clear about what those activities are as well. So it kind of compels us to say, this is real, this is happening, and it's not okay.
It really points to the fact that patriotic education, this is a strategic issue for the Russian government, that they're looking out to the future for decades to come. And this is very much part of their hybrid war, isn't it?
And exactly, and if you're looking to the future, if you're looking about the movement and the general trend around the geopolitics, you look to the children, you look to young people, you look to people with a vulnerability. And children do have vulnerabilities. They have vulnerabilities because they haven't all learnt to read and write or not. Their minds are being shaped and formed by ideas. That's one of the many benefits of being young and of being a child, is the openness that we've got to that. But enshrined in international law, in places like the Geneva Convention, in places like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are specific protections in measure to say that we should protect children precisely because of that vulnerability. And let's be clear, these are being exploited.
The government has just announced this week a second round of sanctions on a very specific number of organizations and individuals involved in the deportation of Ukrainian children. Are you satisfied with that? Do you think that helps in returning these children to their families?
Look, I think the UK government are doing really, really good work on this issue, and I think that is to be commended as well. I would personally want to see more happening than is happening at the moment, and in a few specific areas. Look, first of all, the first thing to say is remembering that these children are there, remembering that they exist. Do not forget these children. So when we're caught up in any peace process or negotiations that are frequently talked about, those children have to be at the forefront of our minds. They are not where they should be. They're not with their families. I also think the UK government's got a really important role in providing leadership in this context, in the humanitarian context, with their counterparts in other governments, so that there is a global response. We know this is a global conflict, and that all the players involved in it, so that everybody essentially has that in mind. And then specifically, we want to hold to account the people that have committed these crimes. We need to see accountability and justice mechanisms as a result.
How can we help getting these children home?
The best thing that listeners can do to help children get home, in my mind, would be to sign the petition. And I think the petition does a number of things. It says to the UK government, these children are not forgotten. Remember them. The UK public care about them as well. And then I would also advocate for supporting War Child. We're working with amazing partners, like I've just described with Save Ukraine. We do work every single day of the week in 14 conflict-affected countries around the world, obviously including Ukraine, that supports exactly this kind of work. So the recovery, how children heal from the trauma inflicted on them by war.
How optimistic are you that they'll be able to come back to Ukraine one day?
The reason why I remain ever an optimist in the job that I do is because of the hope that children give me. So when I talk to children and I hear their stories and I hear what they've been through, some of it is unbelievable and it's incredibly sad. And yet, every single time that I see the work that my colleagues do with children, is I see the hope and I see the possibility and I see, with the correct support, what can happen as a result. And overall, I remain optimistic about the state of what's happening, is because I believe there are passionate people out there that care as deeply as I do, as deeply as War Child and Save Ukraine do, about resolving this situation. And I know many of your listeners feel the same. And it's incumbent on us as a people with that passion, with that optimism, to make sure that these children are not forgotten. And we do everything that we can to support the efforts.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think I would just like to encourage everybody listening. You know, your listeners will be so dedicated to all of these issues and what's happening. And just to add my thanks for that, because whenever I've talked to children caught up in war zones, the key thing is that they are not forgotten. And I think your support, your listening, your taking action, your remembering is really, really inherent in any crisis. So thank you for that.
Johanna Baxter, thank you very much for speaking with me today. We're at the War Child event in Tottenham Court Road. Can you tell me why it's important for you to be here?
I think it's important that all parliamentarians recognise this issue because it's a war crime that's playing out in real time right now, and it's not being given as much attention, I think, as it deserves. So I think it's important to give voice to that, to raise the profile of the issue and make sure that there's a concerted effort to return these children to their homes.
You've been doing a lot of campaigning on the issue of stolen Ukrainian children. How did that issue first come on your radar? And can you briefly tell me what you've been trying to do from the perspective of a British MP?
So it came on my radar when I was on a parliamentary delegation to Ukraine in February. And we met with the Ukrainian Ombudsman on Human Rights, who told us in detail about what was happening. And when he said that it was 19,546 children that had been stolen, I honestly couldn't quite believe what I'd heard, and was stunned, really, that the issue wasn't getting profile over here, certainly at that time. It has done since, but I came away from that just with a determination to try to make sure that people knew what was happening, and that it got attention and focus of the international community to try to prevent further escalation of it, but also to return the children home. So after that delegation, I worked with UK Friends of Ukraine on a report on returning the stolen children of Ukraine, and that outlined the timescale over which this had been happening. It outlined the systematic processes that Russia have put in place to steal Ukrainian children, and it also made a number of recommendations for the government, one of which was about ensuring we expand the sanctions package on those involved. So I'm very pleased that this week the UK government announced an additional package of sanctions on 11 individuals directly involved in the forced deportation of Ukrainian children.
Yes, that's a very good development. I had the then Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, on the show last week to talk about this. And one of my questions to him, and I'd like to hear your take on this, is that sanctions are very good. How do they help getting the children back to their families?
So I think what it does is put additional international pressure on Russia. So Russia now are aware, because of these sanctions, that the international community is taking this issue very seriously. I think in terms of returning the children home, this has to be on the agenda for any peace negotiations that take place, and it has to be right up there at the top of that agenda. Because there can be no lasting peace in Ukraine until the children are returned. And I also think that international pressure helps force Putin's hand in terms of what he's doing here. So he will be aware. And I know he's aware because when I launched that report with UK Friends of Ukraine, I was sanctioned by Russia for daring to give voice to this issue. But it means that he is aware. The international community are looking very closely at what he's doing to these children. It's a war crime playing out in real time, and it has to stop.
Well done on being sanctioned. I'm not yet, but both of my co-hosts are, so I'm waiting for the letter any day now. On the sanctions still, and the mechanism for returning the children, in the first package of sanctions last year, in November 2024, some members of specific organizations like the Kherson Children Home or the Uleshki facility that was a home for children with disabilities. Do you worry, because that's what I've heard from some of my sources on the ground, that these sanctions also may cut ties with some of the negotiations that are happening backstage, hidden from public awareness, with some people in Russia to try to get some specific children back?
I'm not aware of that, but what I would say is that in terms of negotiations with Russia, whatever they say they are doing or will do, it really isn't backed up by the actions they're taking, because they continue to bomb Ukraine indiscriminately, killing civilians, including overnight bombing the Ukrainian government buildings, killing civilians overnight, including a 2-month-old child. So they may say that they want peace, but they continue to bomb indiscriminately. Their actions don't suggest that they do.
What more could be done to help these children come home?
I think it's a very difficult issue, but the work that Save Ukraine and Bring Back the Kids are doing in terms of engaging with third-party interlocutors to negotiate the release of children is very important. But obviously, that's small scale compared to the many thousands of children that have been taken. So I think international pressure is very important, and those negotiations at the highest possible levels of all governments in terms of that focus on bringing them home is urgent. But also I think the rehabilitation of children who are returned, because very many of them have been through absolute unimaginable experiences and are left with, I think, very huge impacts on their mental health, for example, and will need professional support on their return, and will need to assist with that wherever we can.
What more could the UK do, and what should it do to support these efforts? Is it funding? Is it any sort of prosecutorial support, support in terms of logistics? What do you expect? What do you hope the government will do to help on this particular point?
I think the government is doing a lot. So there has been money, there has been additional sanctions. And obviously we announced the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, covering the forced deportation of the children. I think we have to keep additional sanctions under review. Our secretaries of state, our ministers, and making sure that all of these issues are on the agenda during discussions about Ukraine and with Ukraine, and making sure that the efforts are Ukraine-led in terms of what they need as a country to support both the children and those that have been returned.
David Lammy, who is the Foreign Secretary up until a couple of days ago, now Deputy Prime Minister, was announced these sanctions. Do you think it's a good thing, probably, that someone who has Ukraine and the fate of these children at the top of their mind has come even higher in government? Do you have even more expectations now?
I think it's really welcome that he is Deputy Prime Minister. I think he'll be an excellent DPM. And yes, I think having somebody who is so passionate about this issue at the highest levels of government will bring additional focus. But I have to say, I think Keir is very focused, Keir Starmer is very focused on this issue, and I think Yvette Cooper will be a fantastic Secretary of State. So I think actually I have complete confidence in all three of those individuals in making sure that there's a focus on this.
You spoke earlier in our conversation about the lack of public awareness. Why do you think that is? And do you think it has been part of the thinking in government that if we, in the early days of the war, when we could not talk as much about these children in the hope of striking a deal with Russia?
I'm not sure about that latter point, but in terms of why it's not been as widely discussed, I think there is an awful lot happening in the world, and it's very difficult when there are so many conflicts happening to profile certain aspects of each conflict. So I think that's probably why it hasn't been discussed as much. But I would say that whoever I've spoken to about this, if they haven't known about it, they are profoundly moved by it, because it is one of the most heinous crimes of this war. So I think people in this country do care about it, will care about it if they don't already know about it, and will want the government to act. I'm pleased that they have done so far, but as I say, I think we need to continue to keep the pressure up internationally to make sure the issue stays at the highest levels of priority.
What's next in your campaigning?
So on Tuesday I'm hosting a screening in Parliament of Children in the Fire, which is a film documentary about what's happening to these children, and we'll be joined by three of the children who have been returned after they were stolen by Russia. So platforming those children in Parliament to give colleagues in Parliament the opportunity to hear firsthand what's happened to them, I think is very important. And then obviously we'll continue discussions with colleagues in the Foreign Office to see what more we can all do to help.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just think the militarization of these children, I think, is just one really horrendous aspect, which is, children being sent to re-education camps, told that their country doesn't exist, that their families don't want them, and that they should fight for Russia, and then being conscripted into the Russian Youth Military Federation, I think is just so abhorrent. It is unbelievable. And if people don't know that that's happening, I think we really should get that message out there. This is about Putin bolstering his own troops, but it's also about sealing Ukraine's future one child at a time, and it's just horrendous. And the traumatisation of those children also, but these re-education camps, which are dotted all across Russia, across 8 time zones in Russia, just really are abhorrent.
Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, thank you.
By way of final thoughts, I just want to say thanks to everyone who got in touch, sent us some lovely messages, and indeed flowers. Got some lovely flowers on my desk. I know Francis and Adélie have the same, because yesterday obviously was as we said, it was a year to the day since we lost dear old David. So thank you very much for your comments. If you wish, just go and have a look at some of the comments on the Spotify version of yesterday's pod. See some lovely comments by folks. We do appreciate it. It's been a tough year, for everyone. So we do really appreciate your thoughts. Because it was a year ago today, I was having to break the news, which was the first of many truly terrible days. We do appreciate that you're still alongside us. You're still turning up and putting up with my rubbish jokes. James, got any final thoughts, or does the moustache want to speak before it gains sentience?
Well, I wanted to salute you, Francis and Adélie, for keeping the pod on the road in the last year. It has been very hard. David's spirit lives strong, and I think we're all the better for it. So thank you guys very much, and thank you for keeping me on the show as well. It's a great pleasure. As regards Russia and Ukraine, I don't know how well reported it was, but on Friday at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, Putin made one of his stump speeches. He did actually say in that speech that he was only prepared to meet Zelensky in Moscow. That throws a spanner in the works for peace talks. Aside from that, a nice little story I picked up which really shows the impact of the war on ordinary people in Ukraine. Analysis by Russian media has shown that the central fund for road repairs in Russia has been dropped by a third since 2022. Cash has obviously been diverted to fund the war. We know that roughly half the Kremlin's funding expenditure now is directly or indirectly spent on the war and the military-industrial complex. So a very small example of what's happening in Russia regards the war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.